Melvin David Rees, known as the Sex Beast, was an American serial killer who murdered 5 confirmed victims between 1957 and 1959 in Virginia and Maryland, including Margaret Harold and the entire Jackson family of 4 people, driven by sexual sadism and a twisted philosophy that murder was simply part of the human experience he wanted to explore. In the smoky jazz clubs of Washington, D.C. during the late 1950s, audiences would gather to hear the haunting melodies of a talented musician who could make the saxophone sing with an almost supernatural beauty. His name was Melvin David Rees, and to those who knew him casually, he was just another gifted artist trying to make it in the competitive world of music. But behind the stage lights and the polite applause, behind the carefully crafted public persona of a cultured intellectual, lurked something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Melvin Rees was a man who lived 2 completely different lives. By day and into the evening hours, he was the sophisticated jazz musician, well-read and articulate, someone who could discuss philosophy and literature with equal ease as he could discuss musical arrangements. But in the darker hours, when most people were safely asleep in their beds, Rees became something else entirely. He became a predator, a killer driven by urges so twisted and violent that they would eventually claim the lives of at least 5 innocent people and possibly many more. The story of Melvin Rees is not just the story of a serial killer. It is the story of how evil can hide behind a mask of respectability, how a person can appear completely normal to the outside world while harboring the darkest possible intentions. It is a story that begins in mystery and ends in tragedy, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions that would haunt investigators and the families of victims for decades to come. What made Rees particularly dangerous was his intelligence and his ability to blend into society. Unlike many serial killers who are obviously disturbed or who operate on the fringes of society, Rees moved effortlessly through the middle-class world of suburban Maryland and Washington, D.C. He was educated, talented, and charming when he needed to be. He had relationships with women, including a well-known actress and exotic dancer named Pat Barrington. He had friends in the music community who respected his artistic abilities. To most people who encountered him, he seemed like nothing more than a slightly eccentric musician with intellectual pretensions. But beneath this carefully constructed facade was a mind that had become consumed with thoughts of violence and sexual domination. Rees had developed a philosophical framework that allowed him to justify murder as simply another form of human experience, no different from any other activity. He believed that conventional morality was nothing more than artificial constraints imposed by society, and that truly enlightened individuals should be free to explore all aspects of human existence, including the taking of life. This twisted philosophy would eventually drive him to commit acts of unspeakable brutality. His crimes were not random acts of violence or crimes of passion committed in the heat of the moment. Instead, they were carefully planned and executed acts of sadistic cruelty, designed to satisfy his need for complete control over his victims. He did not simply kill people. He tortured them, both physically and psychologically, drawing out their suffering for his own gratification. The investigation that eventually brought Melvin Rees to justice was one of the most challenging and frustrating cases that law enforcement officials in Virginia and Maryland had ever encountered. For years, they had no idea that the various murders they were investigating were connected, let alone that they were dealing with a serial killer who was hiding in plain sight. It was only through a combination of luck, persistence, and the conscience of one of Rees's friends that they were finally able to identify him as the perpetrator and bring him to trial. But even after his arrest and conviction, many questions about Melvin Rees remained unanswered. How many people had he actually killed? Were there other victims whose bodies were never found? How long had he been killing before he committed the crimes for which he was eventually caught? These questions would continue to trouble investigators long after Rees himself was locked away in prison, serving multiple life sentences for his crimes. The story of Melvin Rees is also a story about the time and place in which he lived and operated. The late 1950s were a time of significant social change in America, particularly in urban areas like Washington, D.C. and its surrounding suburbs. The old social constraints were beginning to break down, and new forms of expression and experimentation were becoming more acceptable. For someone like Rees, who was already inclined toward deviant behavior, This changing social landscape provided both opportunities and justifications for his actions. The music scene in which Rees moved was particularly conducive to his activities. Jazz clubs were often located in seedier parts of town. They operated late into the night, and they attracted a diverse crowd of people who valued nonconformity and artistic expression. For a predator like Rees, this environment provided excellent hunting grounds, as well as a ready-made explanation for any unusual behavior he might exhibit. After all, everyone knew that jazz musicians were supposed to be a little strange and unpredictable. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Melvin Rees is a reminder of how difficult it can be to truly know another person. The people who worked with him in the music clubs, the friends who socialized with him at parties, the women who dated him, and even the law enforcement officers who eventually arrested him all struggled to reconcile the charming, intellectual musician they thought they knew with the cold-blooded killer he actually was. It was as if two completely different people had been occupying the same body, and the transition between them had been so seamless that no one had noticed until it was too late. This duality would become a central theme in the Melvin Rees case. How could someone who is capable of creating beautiful music also be capable of committing such ugly acts of violence? How could someone who seemed so normal and well-adjusted harbor such twisted fantasies and desires? These questions would fascinate criminologists and psychologists for years to come, as they tried to understand the mind of a killer who defied easy categorization. The investigation into Rees's crimes would also reveal the limitations of law enforcement techniques in the 1950s. This was still an era when different police departments rarely communicated with each other, when forensic science was in its infancy, and when the concept of a serial killer was not yet widely understood or accepted. As a result, the various murders committed by Rees were initially treated as separate, unrelated crimes, which made it much more difficult for investigators to identify patterns or develop leads. It was only through the intervention of the FBI, which had the resources and authority to coordinate investigations across state lines, that the connections between the different murders finally became clear. Even then, it took years of painstaking work and a considerable amount of luck before investigators were able to identify Rees as the perpetrator and gather enough evidence to bring him to trial. The legal proceedings against Rees would also prove to be complex and challenging. Because his crimes had been committed in multiple jurisdictions, he had to be tried in several different courts, each with its own procedures and requirements. The evidence against him, while compelling, was largely circumstantial, which meant that prosecutors had to build their cases carefully and methodically, presenting a web of connections and coincidences that would convince juries of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout all of this, Rees himself remained something of an enigma. Even after his arrest and conviction, he never provided a complete or satisfactory explanation for his actions. He seemed to view his crimes through the lens of his twisted philosophical framework, treating them as intellectual exercises rather than moral failures. This detachment and lack of remorse only added to the disturbing nature of his case and made it even more difficult for people to understand how someone could commit such acts without apparent emotion or regret. The impact of Rees's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The families and friends of those he killed were left to struggle with grief, anger, and unanswered questions. The communities where his crimes took place were forced to confront the reality that evil could exist among them, hidden behind a mask of respectability. And law enforcement agencies were compelled to reconsider their methods and procedures, recognizing that the traditional approaches to criminal investigation might not be adequate for dealing with this new type of predator. In the years following his conviction, Melvin Rees would become a subject of study for criminologists, psychologists, and other experts who are trying to understand the phenomenon of serial killing. His case would be cited in textbooks and academic papers, dissected and analyzed in an attempt to identify the warning signs and risk factors that might help prevent similar crimes in the future. But for all the attention his case received from experts and academics, Rees himself remained largely silent about his motivations and methods. He spent the remainder of his life in prison, occasionally granting interviews to researchers or journalists, but never providing the kind of detailed confession or explanation that might have shed light on the darker corners of his psyche. When he finally died in prison in 1995, more than 3 decades after his conviction, Melvin Rees took with him the secrets of his crimes and the full extent of his murderous activities. The questions that had surrounded his case from the beginning remained unanswered, leaving investigators, victims' families, and the general public to continue wondering about the true scope of his evil and the reasons behind his transformation from promising musician to sadistic killer. The story that follows is an attempt to piece together the complete narrative of Melvin Rees's life and crimes, based on police reports, court documents, newspaper accounts, and interviews with those who knew him or were involved in his investigation and prosecution. It is a story that reveals not only the details of his specific crimes, but also the broader social and cultural context in which they occurred, and the lasting impact they had on all those whose lives they touched. The early life of Melvin David Rees remains shrouded in mystery and contradiction, much like the man himself would become. Born in 1928, the exact date and circumstances of his birth have been the subject of various rumors and conflicting accounts that paint a picture of a childhood marked by instability and abandonment from the very beginning. According to some sources, Melvin Rees was not actually born in the United States at all, but rather in the United Kingdom. The story goes that he was the product of an unwanted pregnancy and that his biological parents, unable or unwilling to care for him, arranged for him to be sent to America while he was still very young. If this account is true, it would mean that Rees was separated from his biological family and his country of origin while still in early childhood, an experience that could have had profound psychological effects on his development. Other accounts suggest that even if he was born in America, his early childhood was marked by similar instability and rejection. His parents, whoever they were, apparently were unable to provide him with the kind of stable, nurturing environment that children need to develop healthy emotional attachments and a sense of security in the world. Instead, young Melvin found himself being passed from one caretaker to another, never really belonging anywhere or to anyone. What is known with more certainty is that by the time he reached school age, Melvin Rees was living in the eastern United States and attending various educational institutions that specialized in caring for boys who came from troubled or unstable backgrounds. His first documented educational experience was at the Edwards Military Institute in Salemsburg, North Carolina, a school that combined military-style discipline with academic instruction. The Edwards Military Institute was the kind of place where parents sent boys who were having behavioral problems or who needed more structure than they could provide at home. The school emphasized discipline, order, and respect for authority, values that were supposed to help troubled young men develop into responsible adults. For young Melvin, who had already experienced significant instability in his early life, the military school environment may have provided some of the structure he had been lacking. However, the experience of being sent to a military school, particularly for a young child who had already been separated from his family, could also have been traumatic. The emphasis on discipline and conformity, while intended to be helpful, might have felt like yet another form of rejection and abandonment to a boy who was already struggling with feelings of not belonging anywhere. From the Edwards Military Institute, Rees moved on to the Woodward School for Boys in Washington, D.C. This was another institution that specialized in caring for boys from difficult backgrounds, but it was located in a more urban environment and may have provided him with his first real exposure to city life. The Woodward School was known for its academic programs and for helping boys who had shown promise despite their troubled backgrounds to get back on track academically. It was during his time at the Woodward School that young Melvin began to show the intellectual abilities that would later become such a prominent part of his public persona. He was a bright student who seemed to have a natural aptitude for learning, particularly in areas that required abstract thinking and analysis. His teachers noted that he was articulate and well-spoken, with a vocabulary that was advanced for his age. But even as he excelled academically, there were signs that all was not well with the young Melvin Rees. Fellow students and teachers would later remember him as being somewhat aloof and detached from his peers. While he was polite and well-behaved, he seemed to have difficulty forming close friendships or emotional connections with others. He was the kind of student who would participate in class discussions and complete his assignments competently, but who remained something of a mystery to those around him. This pattern of academic success combined with social isolation would continue throughout his educational career. It was as if Melvin had learned to present a confident, even impressive, facade to the world while keeping his true self hidden behind a carefully constructed wall of intellectual sophistication and emotional detachment. After completing his education at the Woodward School for Boys, Rees enrolled at Hyattsville High School in Maryland, where he would finally graduate. Hyattsville was a suburban community outside of Washington, D.C., and attending high school there gave him his first real taste of life in a more normal, middle-class environment. At Hyattsville High School, Rees continued to excel academically while maintaining his pattern of social isolation. He was known as a smart, articulate student who could hold his own in any intellectual discussion, but who seemed to have little interest in the typical social activities that occupied most of his classmates. While other students were dating, playing sports, or participating in extracurricular activities, Melvin seemed to be focused entirely on his studies. It was during his high school years that Rees first began to show a serious interest in music. He had apparently been exposed to music at some point during his earlier education, but it was in high school that he began to develop the skills that would later make him a respected musician in the Washington, D.C. area. He learned to play multiple instruments, including the saxophone, piano, and clarinet, and showed a natural aptitude for understanding complex musical arrangements. Music seemed to provide Melvin with an outlet for expression that he had not found in other areas of his life. While he remained emotionally distant from his classmates, he could pour his feelings into his musical performances in a way that allowed him to connect with audiences without having to reveal too much of himself. It was as if music gave him a way to be intimate with others while still maintaining the emotional distance that seemed so important to him. His teachers and fellow students recognized his musical talent, and he began to develop a reputation as someone who might have a real future in music. This was significant for someone who had spent most of his life feeling like an outsider, as it gave him a sense of identity and purpose that he had not had before. For the first time, he was not just the smart but aloof kid who had been shuffled from one institution to another. He was a musician with real talent and potential. But even as he found success in music, the underlying patterns of his personality remained unchanged. He was still emotionally detached, still unable to form close relationships, and still carrying whatever psychological damage had been done during his early childhood experiences of abandonment and instability. The music may have given him a way to express himself, but it did not address the deeper issues that were already beginning to shape his worldview and his understanding of his place in society. During his high school years, Rees also began to develop the intellectual framework that would later allow him to justify his criminal activities. He was drawn to philosophical and literary works that questioned conventional morality and social norms. He was particularly interested in the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose concepts of the Superman and the rejection of traditional moral constraints seemed to resonate with his own sense of being different from and superior to ordinary people. This intellectual development was significant because it provided Rees with a way to rationalize his feelings of detachment and superiority. Rather than seeing his inability to form normal emotional connections as a problem or a limitation, he began to view it as evidence of his intellectual and moral superiority over the masses of ordinary people who were constrained by conventional thinking and emotional attachments. As he prepared to graduate from high school, Melvin Rees appeared to be a young man with considerable promise. He was intelligent, articulate, musically talented, and seemingly destined for success in whatever field he chose to pursue. But beneath this promising exterior were the seeds of the psychological problems that would eventually drive him to commit acts of unspeakable violence. The question of what caused Melvin Rees to become a killer is one that has fascinated criminologists and psychologists for decades. Was it the apparent abandonment and instability of his early childhood? Was it some inherent psychological defect that would have manifested itself regardless of his circumstances? Or was it a combination of factors, including his intellectual development and his exposure to philosophical ideas that challenged conventional morality? What seems clear is that by the time he graduated from high school, the basic personality traits that would characterize him as an adult were already firmly established. He was intelligent but emotionally detached, talented but unable to form close relationships, and intellectually sophisticated but increasingly contemptuous of conventional moral constraints. These traits, which might have been merely eccentric in another person, would eventually combine in a way that made him extremely dangerous to those around him. The fact that his childhood and early development remains somewhat mysterious is itself significant. The lack of detailed information about his early life suggests that he was already something of an outsider, someone who moved through various institutions and caregivers without forming the kind of lasting bonds that would have left behind more complete records of his experiences and development. This pattern of moving through life without forming lasting connections would continue throughout his adult years, making him difficult for law enforcement to track and allowing him to maintain his double life as both respected musician and dangerous predator. The skills he had developed in childhood for presenting an acceptable facade while keeping his true self hidden would serve him well in his later criminal career, allowing him to blend into respectable society while pursuing his twisted fantasies in secret. As he stood on the threshold of adulthood, Melvin David Rees was a young man who had learned to navigate the world through intelligence and deception rather than through genuine emotional connection. He had developed considerable talents and abilities, but he had also developed a worldview that would eventually lead him to view other human beings as nothing more than objects to be manipulated and used for his own gratification. The stage was set for a life that would be marked by both significant achievements and unspeakable crimes, as the same intelligence and creativity that made him a gifted musician would also make him a particularly dangerous and elusive killer. Following his graduation from Hyattsville High School in Maryland, Melvin David Rees made a decision that would shape the next several years of his life and provide him with experiences that would further contribute to his psychological development. In October 1946, at the age of 18, he enlisted in the United States Army, beginning a period of military service that would take him far from the familiar surroundings of the Washington, D.C. area and expose him to a completely different way of life. The decision to join the Army was not unusual for young men of his generation. World War II had ended just over a year earlier, and military service was still viewed as an honorable and practical choice for young men who were looking to gain some life experience and job skills before settling into civilian careers. For someone like Rees, who had already spent much of his life in institutional settings, the structured environment of the military may have seemed like a natural next step. What was somewhat unusual, however, was the role that Rees would play during his military service. Rather than being assigned to a combat unit or a technical specialty, he was assigned to serve as a military musician. This assignment recognized and utilized the musical talents he had developed during his high school years, and it placed him in a role that was both specialized and somewhat prestigious within the military hierarchy. Military musicians held a unique position within the Army structure. They were enlisted soldiers who were expected to follow orders and maintain military discipline, but they were also artists whose primary responsibility was to provide musical entertainment and ceremonial support for military functions. This dual role required them to be both disciplined soldiers and creative artists, a combination that may have appealed to someone like Rees, who had always been comfortable operating in different roles and presenting different faces to the world. His assignment as a military musician took him to Europe, where he would spend most of his 7 years of military service. This was a significant experience for a young man who had grown up in institutional settings in the American South and Mid-Atlantic regions. Europe in the late 1940s and early 1950s was still recovering from the devastation of World War II, and American military personnel stationed there were witnesses to both the destruction that had been caused by the war and the remarkable efforts being made to rebuild entire cities and societies. For Rees, who had already shown an interest in intellectual and cultural matters, being stationed in Europe provided opportunities for exposure to art, literature, music, and philosophy that he would not have had if he had remained in the United States. European cities, even those that had been heavily damaged during the war, were rich in cultural heritage and offered sophisticated entertainment and educational opportunities that were not available in most American communities at the time. The experience of living in Europe also exposed him to different ways of thinking about morality, society, and individual responsibility. European intellectual traditions, particularly in the aftermath of the war, were grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, the responsibility of individuals for their actions, and the validity of traditional moral and social constraints. These were exactly the kinds of questions that had already begun to interest Rees during his high school years, and his exposure to European philosophical traditions during his military service undoubtedly deepened and expanded his thinking in these areas. As a military musician, Rees would have had opportunities to perform for a variety of audiences and in a variety of settings. Military bands played at ceremonial functions, social events, and entertainment programs for both military personnel and civilian audiences. This performing experience would have helped him develop the stage presence and social skills that would later serve him well in his civilian musical career. But performing as a military musician also required a certain amount of emotional detachment and professional discipline. Musicians had to be able to perform competently regardless of their personal feelings or circumstances, and they had to be able to work effectively with other musicians even if they did not particularly like or get along with them on a personal level. For someone like Rees, who was already inclined toward emotional detachment, this professional requirement may have reinforced and legitimized his tendency to separate his public persona from his private thoughts and feelings. During his military service, Rees also would have been exposed to the realities of military life, including the emphasis on hierarchy, discipline, and the use of force to achieve objectives. While he was not assigned to a combat role, he would have been surrounded by soldiers who had seen combat or who were training for potential combat situations. This exposure to the military mindset, with its acceptance of violence as a necessary and sometimes appropriate tool, may have contributed to his later development of a worldview that saw violence as just another form of human activity. The fact that he served for 7 years, from 1946 to 1953, suggests that he found military life congenial and that he was successful in his role as a military musician. 7 years was a significant commitment, and it indicates that he was able to adapt to military discipline and requirements while continuing to develop his musical skills and abilities. During his time in the military, Rees would also have had opportunities to observe and interact with people from many different backgrounds and cultures. Military service brought together young men from all parts of the United States and exposed them to international cultures and ways of life. For someone who had already felt like an outsider in his own society, this exposure to diversity may have reinforced his sense of being different while also providing him with a broader perspective on human nature and social organization. When his military service ended in 1953, Rees returned to the United States with a much broader range of experiences and a more sophisticated understanding of the world than he had possessed when he enlisted 7 years earlier. He had traveled widely, performed professionally as a musician, lived in different cultures, and been exposed to intellectual traditions that had challenged and expanded his thinking about fundamental questions of human existence. Armed with this experience and these broader perspectives, Rees made the decision to continue his education by enrolling at the University of Maryland in College Park, just outside Washington, D.C. This was a significant step for someone from his background, as university education was still relatively uncommon at the time, particularly for someone who had grown up in institutional settings without the kind of family support and financial resources that most college students took for granted. The University of Maryland campus in College Park was a large, diverse institution that attracted students from throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. For Rees, who had spent the previous 7 years in the structured environment of military service, the relative freedom and intellectual stimulation of university life must have been both exciting and challenging. As a university student, Rees continued to develop his musical abilities while also exploring other intellectual interests. His classmates and professors would later remember him as an exceptionally talented musician who could play saxophone, piano, and clarinet with professional-level skill. His musical abilities were so impressive that he quickly gained a reputation as one of the most gifted student musicians on campus. But even as he excelled musically, Rees maintained the pattern of social isolation that had characterized him throughout his earlier life. While he was polite and articulate in his interactions with classmates and professors, he seemed to have difficulty forming close friendships or romantic relationships. He was the kind of student who would participate actively in class discussions and demonstrate impressive knowledge and analytical abilities, but who remained somehow distant and unapproachable on a personal level. This combination of exceptional talent and social isolation made him something of an enigmatic figure on campus. People recognized his abilities and were impressed by his sophistication and intelligence, but few felt that they really knew him or understood what motivated him. He seemed to move through university life as he had moved through his earlier educational experiences, succeeding academically and professionally while maintaining an emotional distance from those around him. It was during his time at the University of Maryland that Rees began to develop more fully the philosophical framework that would later allow him to justify his criminal activities. The university environment, with its emphasis on questioning conventional assumptions and exploring different ways of understanding the world, provided him with access to philosophical and literary works that reinforced his existing tendencies toward intellectual arrogance and moral relativism. He was particularly drawn to existentialist philosophy, with its emphasis on individual freedom and responsibility, and to the writings of authors who had challenged conventional moral and social constraints. He seemed to interpret these intellectual traditions in a way that supported his own sense of superiority over ordinary people and his belief that truly exceptional individuals should not be bound by the moral rules that govern the behavior of the masses. However, despite his apparent success as a student and musician, Rees never completed his degree at the University of Maryland. After several years of study, he made the decision to drop out of university and pursue a career as a professional musician. This decision was not necessarily unusual, as many talented musicians chose to forego formal academic credentials in favor of practical experience in the music industry. But for Rees, the decision to leave university may also have reflected his growing impatience with conventional social expectations and his desire to pursue a lifestyle that would give him more freedom to explore his developing interests and inclinations. Academic life, even at the university level, still required students to follow certain rules and meet certain requirements, constraints that may have begun to feel limiting to someone who is developing an increasingly grandiose sense of his own importance and capabilities. The years of military service and university education had transformed Melvin Rees from a promising but troubled young man into a sophisticated, talented adult who possessed considerable knowledge and abilities. He had developed professional-level musical skills, gained exposure to diverse cultures and intellectual traditions, and acquired the kind of social polish that would allow him to move comfortably in middle-class and professional circles. But these same years had also reinforced and expanded the psychological traits that would eventually make him dangerous. His natural tendency toward emotional detachment had been legitimized and strengthened by his experiences as a military musician and university student. His sense of intellectual superiority had been fed by his academic success, and his exposure to philosophical traditions that seemed to support his belief in his own exceptional nature. Most significantly, his ability to present different faces to different people and to maintain a carefully constructed public persona while keeping his true thoughts and feelings hidden had been refined and perfected during his years of institutional life. By the time he left the University of Maryland to pursue his musical career, he had become a master of deception, capable of appearing to be whatever kind of person a particular situation required while never revealing his authentic self to anyone. These skills and characteristics would serve him well in his musical career, allowing him to build a professional reputation and gain acceptance in respectable social circles. But they would also enable him to maintain his double life as both respected musician and dangerous predator, as the same abilities that made him an effective performer and social companion also made him capable of concealing his criminal activities and manipulating those around him for his own twisted purposes. As he prepared to enter the professional music world, Melvin David Rees possessed all of the tools he would need to achieve success in his chosen field. But he also possessed the psychological makeup and intellectual framework that would eventually drive him to commit acts of horrific violence against innocent people. The stage was set for a career that would be marked by both artistic achievement and unspeakable crime, as the same talents and abilities that made him a gifted musician would also make him one of the most dangerous and elusive serial killers of his generation. The transition from military service and university life to civilian career marked a crucial period in Melvin David Rees's development, a time when the psychological tensions and antisocial tendencies that had been building beneath his carefully constructed facade began to manifest themselves in increasingly dangerous ways. While he was working to establish himself as a professional musician in the Washington, D.C. area, the same period saw the first clear evidence that his interest in philosophy and intellectual superiority was beginning to translate into actual predatory behavior. In 1954, Rees married fellow University of Maryland student Elaine Rachmaninoff, a decision that on the surface suggested he was following a conventional path toward middle-class respectability. Marriage was expected of young men of his generation, particularly those who were building professional careers, and his choice of a fellow university student seemed to indicate that he was capable of forming the kind of stable relationship that society valued and respected. Elaine Rachmaninoff was an intelligent, educated woman who shared some of Rees's intellectual interests and who was attracted to his combination of musical talent and intellectual sophistication. To those who knew the couple, they seemed well-matched, both bright and cultured individuals who appeared to have the foundation for a successful marriage and family life. The marriage produced a son, Philip, which further reinforced the appearance that Rees was successfully adapting to conventional adult responsibilities. Becoming a father should have provided him with the kind of emotional connection and sense of responsibility that might have helped to counteract his existing tendencies toward detachment and antisocial behavior. The presence of a child in his life should have given him a stake in maintaining his respectable facade and avoiding activities that might jeopardize his family's security and well-being. But even as he was going through the motions of conventional married life, there were signs that all was not well with Melvin Rees. Those who knew the couple noted that he seemed emotionally distant from both his wife and his son, as if he were playing the role of husband and father rather than genuinely inhabiting those roles. He was polite and responsible in his interactions with his family, but there was a quality of detachment and calculation in his behavior that suggested he was going through the motions rather than experiencing genuine emotional connection. This detachment became even more apparent as the marriage progressed. While Elaine tried to build a normal family life, Melvin seemed increasingly preoccupied with his musical career and his intellectual interests. He spent long hours away from home, ostensibly working on his music or socializing with other musicians, and when he was home, he often seemed distracted and distant. It was during this period that Rees's behavior began to take a more ominous turn. In 1955, just 1 year after his marriage, he was arrested on charges of assaulting an unidentified 36-year-old woman. The circumstances of this incident provided the first clear evidence that his philosophical speculations about morality and individual freedom were beginning to translate into actual criminal behavior. According to police reports, Rees had approached the woman and attempted to force her into his car. The attack was not a random crime of opportunity, but rather appeared to be a deliberate and planned assault. He had apparently selected his victim in advance and had approached her with the specific intention of abducting her, presumably for purposes that would have involved further violence and sexual assault. The woman, whose name was never made public, managed to escape from Rees before he could succeed in forcing her into his vehicle. Her escape was likely due to a combination of her own resistance and the public nature of the location where the attack took place, factors that made it difficult for Rees to complete his intended crime without drawing unwanted attention. The fact that he was willing to attempt such an assault in a relatively public location suggests several important things about Rees's psychological state at this time. First, it indicates that his desire to commit violent acts was becoming strong enough to override his usual caution and concern for maintaining his respectable facade. Second, it suggests that he was beginning to believe that his intellectual superiority and philosophical framework gave him the right to act on his violent impulses, regardless of the potential consequences. Most significantly, the assault attempt shows that Rees was beginning to cross the line from fantasy to reality in his approach to violence. While he may have been harboring violent thoughts and sexual fantasies for years, this incident marked the first time that he actually attempted to act on those impulses in a way that would have resulted in serious harm to another person. However, the legal consequences of this first assault were minimal. The victim, perhaps out of fear or embarrassment, chose not to press charges against Rees. This meant that the case was dropped, and he faced no criminal penalties for his actions. From a legal standpoint, the incident was as if it had never happened, leaving no official record that might have alerted future investigators to his dangerous tendencies. But from a psychological standpoint, the incident was extremely significant. The fact that he had attempted to commit a serious violent crime and had faced no consequences for his actions may have reinforced his belief that he was above the normal rules that governed other people's behavior. It may have convinced him that his intellectual superiority and careful planning made him capable of committing crimes without being caught or punished. The lack of consequences also meant that there was nothing to deter him from escalating his criminal behavior in the future. Rather than serving as a warning that might have caused him to reconsider his actions, the dropped charges may have emboldened him to believe that he could continue to act on his violent impulses without facing serious repercussions. Those who knew Rees at the time, including his wife and his friends in the music community, were apparently unaware of the assault incident or chose not to take it seriously. This was partly because the charges were dropped and partly because the incident seemed so out of character for the polite, intellectual musician they thought they knew. It was easier to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding or an anomaly rather than to recognize it as evidence of a fundamental problem with his psychological makeup. This tendency to rationalize or dismiss warning signs would prove to be a recurring theme in the Melvin Rees case. Time and again, People who knew him would observe behavior that should have been recognized as dangerous, but they would find ways to explain it away or minimize its significance. His reputation as an intelligent, cultured musician provided him with a kind of protective camouflage that made it difficult for people to believe that he could be capable of serious criminal behavior. The period following the assault incident saw Rees continuing to develop his musical career, while also maintaining his facade of respectability as a married man and father. He performed regularly at jazz clubs throughout the Washington, D.C. area, building a reputation as a talented and reliable musician. He was known for his technical skill and his ability to perform in a variety of musical styles, and he was generally well regarded by both audiences and fellow musicians. But even as he was achieving professional success, his personal relationships continued to deteriorate. His marriage to Elaine became increasingly strained, partly because of his emotional detachment and partly because of his growing involvement in activities that took him away from home for long periods of time. While he maintained the outward appearance of being a responsible husband and father, those closest to him could see that his heart was not really in his domestic responsibilities. The strain in his marriage was also exacerbated by his developing relationship with other women. Despite being married, Rees began to pursue relationships with women he met through his musical career, including exotic dancers and actresses who were attracted to his combination of musical talent and intellectual sophistication. These relationships were not merely casual affairs, but rather represented a pattern of behavior that suggested he viewed marriage and family responsibilities as constraints that he was entitled to ignore when they conflicted with his personal desires. One of the most significant of these relationships was with actress and topless dancer Pat Barrington, who performed under various stage names in the Washington, D.C. area. Barrington was an attractive, vivacious woman who was drawn to the bohemian lifestyle associated with the entertainment industry. She was attracted to Rees's combination of musical talent, intellectual sophistication, and apparent emotional intensity, and she saw him as a more interesting and challenging partner than the conventional men she had dated in the past. For Rees, the relationship with Barrington represented an opportunity to explore aspects of his personality and desires that he could not express within the confines of his conventional marriage. Barrington moved in circles that were more accepting of non-conventional behavior and alternative lifestyles, and she was not shocked or disturbed by some of the philosophical ideas and attitudes that he had been developing. However, even Barrington began to notice troubling aspects of Rees's personality and behavior. She would later describe him as being emotionally distant and manipulative, someone who seemed to view their relationship as an intellectual exercise rather than a genuine emotional connection. She also noted that he had unusual attitudes toward violence and power, often making comments that suggested he viewed conventional morality as weakness and that he believed exceptional individuals should be free to act according to their own desires rather than society's rules. As his relationship with Barrington developed, Rees's marriage to Elaine continued to deteriorate. The couple eventually divorced after about 5 years of marriage, with Elaine taking custody of their son Philip. The divorce was apparently amicable on the surface, but it represented the failure of Rees's attempt to maintain a conventional family life and suggested that his antisocial tendencies were becoming too strong to be contained within normal social structures. The failure of his marriage and his increasing involvement with women like Pat Barrington marked an important transition in Rees's life. He was moving away from any pretense of conventional respectability and toward a lifestyle that would give him more freedom to explore his developing criminal inclinations. The constraints of marriage and family life had provided some check on his behavior, but with those constraints removed, he was free to pursue whatever activities appealed to him, regardless of their legality or morality. During this period, Rees also began to develop a more explicit philosophical justification for antisocial behavior. He became increasingly interested in the writings of philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, particularly the concept of the Superman who was beyond conventional moral constraints. He began to see himself as one of these exceptional individuals who had the right and even the responsibility to transcend ordinary moral limitations and explore all aspects of human experience, including those that society condemned. This philosophical framework provided him with an intellectual justification for the violent impulses he had been experiencing, transforming them from shameful urges that needed to be suppressed into legitimate expressions of his superior nature. Rather than seeing his interest in violence and domination as evidence of psychological problems, He began to view them as signs of his intellectual and spiritual evolution beyond the limitations that constrained ordinary people. The combination of increased freedom from social constraints and a more developed philosophical justification for antisocial behavior created the conditions for Rees to escalate from the attempted assault of 1955 to more serious and successful criminal acts. The stage was set for him to cross the line from someone who fantasized about violence to someone who actually committed acts of horrific brutality against innocent victims. Following his divorce from Elaine Rachmaninoff in the late 1950s, Melvin David Rees threw himself more fully into his musical career, using his considerable talents as a saxophonist, pianist, and clarinetist to establish himself as a respected figure in the Washington, D.C. jazz scene. This period of his life represented both the peak of his artistic achievements and the beginning of his most dangerous phase as a predator, as the same social connections and lifestyle that advanced his musical career also provided him with opportunities to identify and pursue potential victims. The Washington, D.C. area in the late 1950s was home to a vibrant and sophisticated jazz scene that attracted both local musicians and touring artists from across the country. The clubs and venues where jazz was performed were typically located in the more bohemian and nighttime-oriented parts of the city, places where conventional social rules were more relaxed, and where people came to enjoy music, drinks, and the kind of intellectual and artistic conversation that was associated with the jazz subculture. For someone like Rees, who possessed genuine musical talent and intellectual sophistication, this environment was ideal. He was able to establish himself as a regular performer at some of the most prestigious jazz venues in the area, building a reputation for technical excellence and artistic versatility. His ability to play multiple instruments competently made him a valuable addition to various musical ensembles, and his intellectual demeanor and articulate speaking style made him popular with both audiences and fellow musicians. The jazz clubs where Rees performed were typically small, intimate venues where musicians and audience members interacted closely. Unlike larger concert halls where performers remained distant from their audiences, jazz clubs encouraged a sense of community and shared appreciation for the music. This environment allowed Rees to develop the kind of personal connections and social network that would serve both his musical career and his criminal activities. As his reputation grew, Rees began to attract attention from music critics and industry professionals who recognized his talent and saw him as someone who might achieve broader success in the music industry. He was invited to perform at increasingly prestigious venues and events, and there was speculation that he might eventually be able to make the transition from local performer to national recording artist. But even as he was achieving professional success, those who worked closely with him began to notice troubling aspects of his personality and behavior. Fellow musicians noted that while he was technically proficient and reliable as a performer, he seemed emotionally detached from the music and from his colleagues. He could deliver polished, competent performances, but there was a quality of calculation and emotional distance in his playing that set him apart from musicians who seemed to be genuinely passionate about their art. This detachment extended to his personal interactions as well. While he was articulate and intellectually engaging in conversation, people who spent time with him often came away feeling that they had not really gotten to know him. He seemed to be performing the role of the sophisticated jazz musician rather than genuinely inhabiting that identity, and there was always a sense that he was holding something back or concealing his true thoughts and feelings. During this period, Rees also began to develop a reputation for having unusual philosophical and moral views. In conversations with fellow musicians and club patrons, he would often express ideas that challenged conventional morality and social norms. He seemed particularly interested in exploring concepts related to individual freedom, the arbitrariness of moral rules, and the right of exceptional individuals to transcend ordinary limitations. These conversations were not necessarily alarming themselves, as the jazz subculture of the 1950s was generally tolerant of nonconformist ideas and intellectual experimentation. Many jazz musicians and their associates were drawn to philosophical and artistic movements that challenged mainstream values, and discussions of existentialism, moral relativism, and individual freedom were common in the clubs where Rees performed. However, Some of those who engaged with Rees in these philosophical discussions began to sense that his interest in these topics was not merely intellectual. There was an intensity and personal investment in his exploration of moral relativism that suggested he was not just examining these ideas as abstract concepts, but was actually considering how they might apply to his own life and behavior. One person who became particularly concerned about Rees's philosophical development was Glenn Moser, a friend and acquaintance who had numerous conversations with him about morality, violence, and individual responsibility. Moser would later recall that Rees seemed obsessed with the question of whether murder could be considered morally acceptable under certain circumstances, and whether individuals who were intellectually or spiritually superior to ordinary people had the right to ignore conventional moral constraints. In one particularly disturbing conversation, Moser remembered Rees arguing that murder was simply another form of human experience, no different from any other activity, and that the only thing that made it seem wrong was social conditioning and arbitrary moral rules. According to Moser, Rees seemed to believe that truly enlightened individuals should be willing to explore all aspects of human existence, including those that society condemned as evil or immoral. What made these conversations even more troubling was the timing. Moser would later realize that some of his most disturbing discussions with Rees had taken place shortly before violent crimes were committed in the Washington, D.C. area, crimes that would later be connected to Rees himself. It was as if Rees was using these philosophical discussions to work through his own moral justifications for acts of violence that he was already planning or considering. Despite these concerning aspects of his personality, Rees continued to attract romantic and sexual partners who were drawn to his combination of musical talent, intellectual sophistication, and apparent emotional intensity. The jazz scene provided him with access to a variety of women, including musicians, dancers, artists, and others who were attracted to the bohemian lifestyle associated with the music industry. His most significant relationship during this period was with Pat Barrington, the actress and exotic dancer who had originally been attracted to his combination of talent and intellectual sophistication. Barrington was a complex and intelligent woman who had her own experiences with unconventional lifestyles and alternative moral frameworks, and she initially saw Rees as someone who shared her interest in exploring the boundaries of conventional behavior. However, as their relationship developed, Barrington began to recognize troubling aspects of Rees's personality that went beyond mere intellectual nonconformity. She noticed that he seemed to view their relationship as a kind of experiment or intellectual exercise rather than a genuine emotional connection. He was attentive and charming when it suited his purposes, but he seemed incapable of the kind of spontaneous emotional intimacy that characterized healthy romantic relationships. Barrington also became concerned about Rees's attitudes toward violence and power. He seemed fascinated by stories of violence and domination, and he often made comments that suggested he viewed conventional morality as weakness and conventional social relationships as forms of voluntary slavery. He seemed to believe that truly exceptional individuals should be free to take whatever they wanted from life, regardless of the impact on other people. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Barrington began to notice that Rees seemed to have an unusual interest in controlling and manipulating the people around him. He appeared to take pleasure in psychological manipulation and in creating situations where he had power over others. This tendency manifested itself in various ways, from subtle manipulation of conversations to more overt attempts to control her behavior and choices. Despite these concerns, Barrington continued her relationship with Rees, partly because she was attracted to his talents and intellect, and partly because she did not fully understand the extent of his psychological problems. Like many people who encountered him, she found ways to rationalize or minimize the troubling aspects of his behavior, telling herself that his unusual attitudes were simply the result of his intellectual sophistication and artistic temperament. During this period, Rees also began to experiment with drugs, particularly amphetamines, which he used to stay alert during late-night performances and to enhance his energy and focus during musical sessions. The use of amphetamines was not uncommon among jazz musicians, who often worked late hours and needed artificial stimulation to maintain their performance levels throughout long nights of playing. However, for someone with Rees's psychological makeup, the use of stimulant drugs may have had particularly dangerous effects. Amphetamines can increase aggression and reduce inhibitions, effects that could have made his existing violent tendencies more likely to manifest in actual behavior. The drugs may also have contributed to his growing sense of superiority and invincibility, reinforcing his belief that he was above ordinary moral and legal constraints. As his drug use increased, some of those around him began to notice changes in his behavior and personality. He became more erratic and unpredictable, sometimes displaying bursts of intense energy and enthusiasm followed by periods of withdrawal and isolation. His philosophical discussions became more extreme and disturbing, and his relationships with women became more manipulative and controlling. The combination of increased freedom from social constraints, a developing philosophical justification for antisocial behavior, access to potential victims through his musical career, and the behavioral effects of drug use created a perfect storm of conditions that made it increasingly likely that Rees would escalate from philosophical speculation about violence to actual criminal acts. The jazz scene that had nurtured his musical talents and provided him with social connections was also providing him with the opportunities and justifications he needed to begin acting on his most dangerous impulses. By the late 1950s, Melvin David Rees had established himself as a respected figure in the Washington, D.C. jazz scene while simultaneously developing into a dangerous predator who was actively seeking opportunities to act on his violent fantasies. His musical career provided him with the perfect cover for his criminal activities, as it gave him a legitimate reason to be out late at night, to travel to different locations, and to interact with a wide variety of people without arousing suspicion. The stage was set for him to make the transition from someone who thought and talked about violence to someone who actually committed acts of horrific brutality against innocent victims. His musical talents and intellectual sophistication had gained him acceptance in respectable society, but they had also provided him with the tools and opportunities he needed to become one of the most dangerous serial killers of his generation. The evening of June 26, 1957, started like any other pleasant summer night for Margaret Harold and her boyfriend, United States Army Sergeant Roy Hudson. The young couple had decided to take advantage of the warm weather and Hudson's weekend leave from military duty by taking a leisurely drive through the countryside near Annapolis, Maryland. It was the kind of simple, innocent activity that countless couples engaged in during the 1950s, a chance to spend time together away from the pressures of daily life and enjoy each other's company in the peaceful setting of rural Maryland. Margaret Harold was an attractive young woman in her early 20s who had been dating Sergeant Hudson for some time. She was known to her friends and family as a cheerful, outgoing person who enjoyed life and was looking forward to a future that seemed full of promise. Hudson was a career military man who had served his country honorably and who was regarded by his superiors and colleagues as a responsible, dependable soldier. Together, they represented the kind of wholesome, all-American couple that embodied the values and aspirations of their generation. As they drove along the quiet country roads near Annapolis that evening, Harold and Hudson had no way of knowing that they were being stalked by a predator who had been watching and waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Melvin David Rees had spent considerable time during the previous weeks and months identifying potential victims and scouting locations where he might be able to commit the kind of violent crime that his twisted philosophical framework had convinced him was not only acceptable, but actually necessary for his personal development. Rees had chosen the area around Annapolis for several reasons. It was far enough from Washington, D.C. to reduce the likelihood that he would be recognized by anyone who knew him from his musical career, but close enough that he could easily travel there and return home without his absence being noticed. The rural roads in the area provided numerous isolated locations where a crime could be committed without fear of interruption, and the fact that the area was popular with couples seeking privacy meant that potential victims could be found there on a regular basis. On this particular evening, Rees was driving his green Chrysler sedan when he spotted Harold and Hudson's car traveling along one of the quiet country roads he had been monitoring. The sight of the young couple driving alone in an isolated area must have triggered the violent fantasies that had been building in his mind for months or possibly years. Here was the perfect opportunity to act on the impulses that his philosophical studies had convinced him were legitimate expressions of his superior nature. Rather than simply following the couple to see where they might stop, Rees made the decision to force a confrontation immediately. Using his car as a weapon, he began to pursue Harold and Hudson aggressively, forcing their vehicle off the road and creating a situation where they would have no choice but to interact with him. This was not a crime of opportunity or a sudden impulse, but rather a carefully calculated act of predation by someone who had already decided that he was going to commit violence against whoever happened to cross his path that evening. When Harold and Hudson's car came to a stop, forced off the road by Rees's aggressive driving, the young couple must have been confused and frightened by what was happening to them. They had no way of knowing why this stranger had forced them off the road, and they probably assumed that they were dealing with either a case of road rage or perhaps someone who was having car trouble and needed assistance. Rees exited his vehicle and approached their car with what witnesses would later describe as an unnaturally calm and controlled demeanor. He was not acting like someone who was angry or upset, but rather like someone who was completely in control of the situation and who knew exactly what he intended to do next. This calculated calmness was perhaps even more frightening than obvious anger would have been, as it suggested that whatever was about to happen had been planned in advance. When he reached their car, Rees gestured for the couple to roll down their window, a request that seemed reasonable enough under the circumstances. Harold and Hudson, probably still hoping that this was some kind of misunderstanding that could be resolved through conversation, complied with his request. It was at this point that Rees revealed the .38 caliber revolver that he had brought with him, making it clear that this was not a case of road rage or a request for assistance, but rather planned criminal assault. The sight of the gun must have been terrifying for both Harold and Hudson, as it transformed what they had thought might be a minor traffic incident into a potentially life-threatening situation. Rees's calm demeanor, rather than providing reassurance, probably made the situation even more frightening, as it suggested that he was someone who was comfortable with violence and who had no hesitation about using the weapon he was displaying. Rees's first demands were for money and cigarettes, items that suggested this might be a robbery rather than something more sinister. Harold and Hudson, probably hoping that they could resolve the situation by giving him what he wanted, searched their possessions to see what they could provide. However, they quickly discovered that they had neither money nor cigarettes to give him, a discovery that seemed to anger Rees and to escalate the situation beyond their ability to control. The fact that Harold and Hudson could not provide what he had demanded seemed to trigger something in Rees that went far beyond normal criminal behavior. Rather than simply taking whatever valuables they might have had or searching their car for anything of value, he became focused on Margaret Harold herself. It was at this point that the encounter shifted from what might have been a robbery to something much more sinister and personal. Without warning and without any additional provocation, Rees pointed his revolver directly at Margaret Harold's face and pulled the trigger. The shot was fired at point-blank range, killing her instantly and spattering blood throughout the interior of the car. The suddenness and brutality of the act was shocking even by the standards of violent crime, as there had been no escalation of threats or violence that might have led up to such an extreme action. The murder of Margaret Harold was not a crime of passion or the result of a struggle that had gotten out of hand. It was a cold-blooded execution carried out by someone who had already decided that he was going to kill someone that evening, and who was simply carrying out a plan that he had probably been developing for some time. The fact that he shot her in the face, the most personal and intimate form of violence, suggested that this was not simply about ending her life, but about exercising complete power and dominance over another human being. Sergeant Hudson, who had been sitting next to Harold when she was murdered, was traumatized beyond description by what he had witnessed. The woman he cared about had been killed right next to him in the most brutal and senseless way imaginable, and he was now alone with a man who had just demonstrated that he was capable of unspeakable violence. Hudson's survival instincts took over, and he made the desperate decision to flee from the car and try to escape before Rees could kill him as well. Hudson's escape from the scene was probably the only thing that saved his life, as Rees was almost certainly planning to kill him as well. The fact that he was allowed to flee suggests that Rees may have been caught off guard by his reaction, or that he was more interested in what he could do with Harold's body than in pursuing Hudson. Whatever the reason, Hudson's escape meant that there would be a witness to the crime who could provide police with a description of both the perpetrator and the circumstances of the murder. Hudson ran across several rural fields in the dark, driven by terror and adrenaline, until he finally reached a farmhouse where he was able to call for help. The farmers who answered their door that night found a man who was clearly in a state of severe shock and trauma, barely able to communicate what had happened but desperately trying to get help from Margaret Harold, even though she was already beyond any assistance that could be provided. While Hudson was fleeing across the fields and seeking help, Rees remained at the scene with Harold's body. What happened during this time would not be fully understood until police arrived and began their investigation, but the evidence they found suggested that Rees used this opportunity to act out the sexual fantasies that had probably been the real motivation for the attack all along. When police officers arrived at the scene in response to Hudson's call for help, they found Margaret Harold's body in the car where she had been shot. However, they also discovered that Rees had removed her clothing and had sexually assaulted her corpse, an act of necrophilia that revealed the true depth of his psychological depravity. This was not simply a case of robbery gone wrong, or even a crime of sexual assault followed by murder to eliminate a witness. It was the calculated act of a sexual predator who had planned from the beginning to kill his victim and then use her body for his own twisted gratification. The crime scene evidence painted a picture of someone who was not only capable of cold-blooded murder, but who was also driven by sexual fantasies that involved complete domination and control over his victims. The fact that he had remained at the scene to assault Harold's body after killing her suggested that the murder itself was not the ultimate goal, but rather a means to an end, a way of obtaining a victim who could not resist or escape from whatever he wanted to do to her. Police investigators were shocked by the brutality and depravity of the crime, which was unlike anything they had encountered in their previous experience. The combination of the calculated nature of the attack, the point-blank execution, and the post-mortem sexual assault suggested that they were dealing with someone who was not only extremely dangerous, but who was likely to commit similar crimes in the future unless he was caught and stopped. The investigation into Margaret Harold's murder began immediately, with police interviewing Hudson extensively to get as complete a description as possible of both the perpetrator and the circumstances of the crime. Hudson, despite his traumatic experience, was able to provide investigators with a detailed description of Rees, including his physical appearance, the type of car he was driving, and his general demeanor during the attack. Based on Hudson's description, police began searching for a man of average height and build with dark hair who had been driving a green Chrysler sedan. They also began canvassing the area around the crime scene, looking for anyone who might have seen the perpetrator before or after the attack, and searching for additional evidence that might help them identify and locate him. During their investigation of the immediate area around the crime scene, police made another disturbing discovery that suggested the Margaret Harold murder was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior. Not far from where Harold had been killed, investigators found an abandoned building that appeared to have been used as some kind of base of operations for criminal activity. Inside this abandoned building, police discovered a collection of pornographic photographs and materials that had been carefully arranged and displayed on the walls. The images were of a particularly violent and degrading nature, focusing on themes of sexual domination and violence against women. The arrangement of the materials suggested that someone had been using this location as a kind of private retreat where they could indulge their violent fantasies and plan future criminal acts. The discovery of this pornographic material was significant for several reasons. First, it suggested that whoever had killed Margaret Harold had been planning and fantasizing about similar acts for some time before actually carrying them out. Second, it indicated that this person had a base of operations in the area and was likely familiar with the local geography and the patterns of behavior of potential victims. Most importantly, it suggested that this was not likely to be an isolated crime, but rather the first in what could become a series of similar attacks. However, despite the significant evidence they had gathered, including Hudson's detailed description of the perpetrator and the discovery of the abandoned building with its disturbing contents, police were unable to immediately identify a suspect in Margaret Harold's murder. The investigation continued for weeks and months, with officers following up on various leads and tips, but no arrests were made and no clear suspect emerged. The failure to quickly solve the Margaret Harold murder was frustrating for both law enforcement and the general public, who were understandably concerned about the possibility that a dangerous sexual predator was operating in their area. The brutal nature of the crime and the evidence suggesting that it was likely to be repeated made it a high-priority case, but the lack of concrete leads made it difficult for investigators to make progress. What police did not know at the time was that Melvin David Rees had already returned to his normal life as a jazz musician in Washington, D.C., where he continued to perform regularly and maintain his reputation as a talented and respectable member of the music community. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal activities and maintain his public persona meant that no one in his social or professional circle had any reason to suspect that he might be connected to such a horrific crime. The murder of Margaret Harold marked a crucial turning point in Rees's criminal career, as it represented his successful transition from someone who fantasized about violence to someone who had actually committed murder and sexual assault. The fact that he had been able to carry out such a brutal crime without being caught probably reinforced his belief in his own superiority and invincibility, setting the stage for even more horrific crimes in the future. For the family and friends of Margaret Harold, the murder was a devastating tragedy that would affect them for the rest of their lives. A young woman who had been full of life and promise had been senselessly killed by a stranger who had targeted her for no reason other than his own twisted gratification. The randomness and brutality of her death made it even more difficult for those who loved her to come to terms with their loss. Sergeant Hudson, who had witnessed the murder and narrowly escaped with his own life, was left to deal with the psychological trauma of what he had experienced. The memory of watching his girlfriend being murdered in front of him would haunt him for years to come, and he would struggle with feelings of guilt and helplessness about his inability to prevent her death or to catch her killer. The Margaret Harold murder also had broader implications for the community and for law enforcement agencies in the area. It served as a wake-up call about the existence of predators who were capable of extreme violence and who were operating with apparent impunity. The fact that such a crime could be committed by someone who then simply melted back into the general population was a disturbing reminder of how difficult it could be to protect innocent people from those who were determined to do them harm. As the investigation into Margaret Harold's murder continued without resolution, police had no way of knowing that they were dealing with someone who was already planning his next attack. Melvin David Rees had proven to himself that he was capable of committing the kind of violent crime that his philosophical framework had convinced him was acceptable, and he had done so without facing any consequences for his actions. The stage was set for him to escalate his criminal behavior even further, leading to crimes that would be even more shocking and brutal than the murder of Margaret Harold. The immediate aftermath of Margaret Harold's murder on June 26, 1957, marked the beginning of one of the most challenging and frustrating criminal investigations that law enforcement agencies in Maryland had ever undertaken. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with the apparent randomness of the attack and the calculated behavior of the perpetrator, presented investigators with a case unlike anything they had encountered in their previous experience. The investigation began with the extensive debriefing of Sergeant Roy Hudson, the sole surviving witness to the attack. Hudson, despite being severely traumatized by what he had witnessed, was able to provide investigators with a remarkably detailed description of both the perpetrator and the circumstances of the crime. His military training and experience had taught him to observe details carefully even under stress, and his account would prove to be one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in the early stages of the investigation. According to Hudson's account, the attacker was a white male of medium height and build, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and a clean-shaven face. He had been wearing casual clothing and had appeared calm and controlled throughout the encounter, never showing signs of agitation or emotional distress even while committing murder. Most significantly, he had been driving a green Chrysler sedan, a detail that investigators hoped would help them identify and locate the perpetrator. The description provided by Hudson was circulated to law enforcement agencies throughout Maryland and the surrounding states, and police began the process of checking motor vehicle records to identify owners of green Chrysler sedans who matched the physical description of the suspect. This was a time-consuming process that had to be done largely by hand, as the computerized databases that would later make such searches much easier did not yet exist. While some officers were working on identifying potential suspects based on Hudson's description, others were conducting a thorough investigation of the crime scene itself. The location where Margaret Harold had been murdered was carefully searched for any physical evidence that might provide clues about the identity of the perpetrator or his methods of operation. The crime scene investigation revealed several important pieces of information. First, the position of Harold's car and the tire tracks in the area confirmed Hudson's account that they had been forced off the road by the perpetrator's vehicle. This established that the attack had been deliberate and planned rather than a chance encounter or a crime of opportunity. Second, ballistics analysis of the bullet that had killed Harold revealed that it had been fired from a .38 caliber revolver, a common type of handgun that was owned by many people throughout the area. While this information was not immediately helpful in identifying a specific suspect, it would later prove to be crucial when investigators were able to locate the murder weapon. Most significantly, The investigation of the crime scene led to the discovery of the abandoned building where the perpetrator had apparently been planning and fantasizing about his crimes. This building, located not far from where Harold had been murdered, contained a disturbing collection of pornographic materials that provided insight into the mind of the killer and suggested that the Harold murder was not an isolated incident. The pornographic materials found in the abandoned building were of a particularly violent and degrading nature, focusing on themes of sexual domination, violence against women, and necrophilia. The images had been carefully arranged and displayed on the walls in a way that suggested someone had been using this location as a private retreat where they could indulge their violent fantasies without fear of discovery. The discovery of this material was significant for several reasons. First, it indicated that the perpetrator had been operating in the area for some time before committing the Harold murder, and that he had been carefully planning and preparing for his crimes. Second, the nature of the materials suggested that he was driven by sexual fantasies that involved extreme violence and domination, which meant that he was likely to commit similar crimes in the future unless he was caught and stopped. Most importantly, the abandoned building and its contents suggested that the perpetrator was someone who was familiar with a local area and who had spent considerable time scouting locations and identifying potential victims. This was not the work of a transient criminal or someone who had committed a crime of passion, but rather the carefully planned activities of a predator who had been operating in the area for an extended period. The investigation also involved extensive interviews with local residents, business owners, and anyone else who might have seen something suspicious in the area around the time of the murder. Police were particularly interested in finding anyone who might have seen a green Chrysler sedan in the area, either on the night of the murder or during the weeks and months leading up to it. These interviews produced a number of potential leads, including several reports of people who had seen a man matching the suspect's description in the area during the weeks before the murder. Some witnesses reported seeing him alone, apparently surveying the area and taking note of the traffic patterns and the types of people who frequented the location. Others reported seeing him with a green Chrysler, sometimes parked in locations that would have provided good vantage points for observing potential victims. However, despite the wealth of information that was gathered during these interviews, police were unable to develop any solid leads that pointed to a specific suspect. The descriptions provided by various witnesses were consistent with Hudson's account, but they were also generic enough that they could have applied to thousands of men in the area. The green Chrysler sedan was also a common enough vehicle that checking all possible owners would require enormous resources and time. As the investigation continued through the summer and fall of 1957, police began to expand their search beyond the immediate area where the murder had occurred. They contacted law enforcement agencies in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and other nearby states to see if there had been similar crimes that might be connected to the Harold murder. This broader investigation produced some interesting but inconclusive results. There had been several unsolved murders of young women in the region during the previous few years, and some of these cases had involved similar patterns of behavior, including the apparent targeting of couples in isolated locations and evidence of sexual assault. However, none of these cases had produced enough evidence to definitively link them to the Harold murder or to identify a common perpetrator. The investigation was also hampered by the limited communication and coordination between different law enforcement agencies at the time. In the 1950s, police departments typically operated independently and rarely shared information about ongoing investigations unless there was a specific reason to do so. This meant that potentially important connections between crimes committed in different jurisdictions might not be recognized for months or years, if at all. As 1957 turned into 1958, the Margaret Harold murder investigation began to lose momentum. While police continued to follow up on occasional tips and leads, the case was no longer receiving the intensive attention it had received in the immediate aftermath of the crime. Other cases demanded attention, and without any new evidence or leads, there was little that investigators could do beyond waiting for something to break the case open. During this time, Melvin David Rees continued to live his double life as a respected jazz musician in Washington, D.C. He performed regularly at local clubs, maintained his relationships with fellow musicians and women like Pat Barrington, and gave no outward indication that he was connected to one of the area's most notorious unsolved crimes. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal activities and maintain his public persona allowed him to operate without attracting suspicion from anyone in his social or professional circle. The lack of progress in the Harold murder investigation was frustrating for everyone involved, from the police officers who had worked on the case to the family and friends of the victim who were desperate for justice. The brutal nature of the crime and the evidence suggesting that the perpetrator was likely to strike again made it a high-priority case, but the lack of concrete leads made it difficult for investigators to make any real progress. What made the situation even more frustrating was the knowledge that the perpetrator was almost certainly still in the area and possibly planning additional crimes. The abandoned building with its collection of violent pornography had been clearly established as a base of operations for someone who was actively fantasizing about and planning violent sexual crimes. The fact that this person had successfully committed one such crime and escaped detection probably meant that he would be emboldened to commit additional crimes in the future. Police tried various approaches to generate new leads in the case. They released additional details about the crime to the media in hopes that publicity might prompt someone to come forward with information. They conducted additional searches of the area around the crime scene, looking for evidence that might have been missed during the initial investigation. They also continued to check motor vehicle records and follow up on tips from the public, no matter how unlikely they seemed. One approach that proved particularly frustrating was the attempt to identify the source of the pornographic materials found in the abandoned building. Police hoped that by tracing these materials back to their point of sale, they might be able to identify someone who had purchased similar items and who matched the physical description of the suspect. However, this approach was hindered by the fact that such materials were often sold through informal networks and underground channels that kept few records and whose participants were reluctant to cooperate with police. As the first anniversary of Margaret Harold's murder approached in the summer of 1958, police made one final major push to generate new leads in the case. They held a press conference to release additional details about the crime and to appeal directly to the public for any information that might help identify the perpetrator. They also announced a reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction, hoping that the financial incentive might encourage someone to come forward. This publicity campaign did generate a number of tips and leads, but most of them proved to be false or unproductive. People called to report suspicious neighbors or acquaintances, to describe encounters with men who matched the suspect's description, or to offer theories about who might have committed the crime. However, none of these tips produced any solid evidence that could advance the investigation. The failure to solve the Margaret Harold murder within the first year after it was committed was particularly disappointing because it meant that the case was beginning to grow cold. In the days before modern forensic techniques and computerized databases, unsolved cases that did not produce quick results often remained unsolved permanently. The longer a case went without new evidence or leads, the less likely it became that it would ever be resolved. However, what police investigators did not know at the time was that their failure to solve the Harold murder quickly had emboldened Melvin David Rees to begin planning an even more ambitious and horrific crime. The fact that he had successfully killed Margaret Harold and sexually assaulted her corpse without being caught had convinced him that his philosophical framework was correct and that he was indeed superior to ordinary people and their moral constraints. The success of his first murder had also proven to him that his careful planning and methodical approach to crime could allow him to satisfy his violent fantasies without facing consequences. Rather than being satisfied with what he had accomplished, the Harold murder had instead whetted his appetite for even more extreme acts of violence and domination. As 1958 turned into 1959, Rees began to develop plans for a crime that would be even more shocking and brutal than the Harold murder. Rather than targeting a single victim, he began to fantasize about attacking an entire family, allowing him to exercise complete control over multiple victims and to explore the full range of his violent and sexual impulses without fear of interruption. The stage was set for a crime that would be even more horrific than the murder of Margaret Harold, a crime that would finally provide investigators with the evidence they needed to identify and apprehend one of the most dangerous predators of his generation. The investigation that had begun with Margaret Harold's murder would continue for nearly 3 more years before reaching its conclusion, but when it finally did, it would reveal the true scope of Melvin David Rees's evil and bring justice for his victims. The cold winter evening of January 11, 1959, began as an ordinary family outing for Carroll Vernon Jackson Jr., his wife Mildred, and their two young daughters, Susan, aged 4, and Janet, only 18 months old. The family had spent the day visiting relatives in the Apple Grove area of Louisa County, Virginia, and were making their way home along the quiet country roads that connected the small rural communities of central Virginia. Carroll, who worked as a truck driver, was familiar with these roads from his professional travels, and the family had no reason to expect that their routine trip home would lead them into the path of one of the most dangerous predators operating in the region. Carroll Jackson was a hardworking man who took his responsibilities as a husband and father seriously. At 29 years old, he had established himself as a reliable truck driver who was well regarded by his employer and his colleagues. He was known in his community as a quiet, dependable person who focused on providing for his family and who avoided the kind of trouble that sometimes plagued other young men of his generation. Mildred Jackson, also 29, was a devoted wife and mother who had dedicated her life to caring for her husband and daughters. She was known for her gentle nature and her commitment to her family, and those who knew her described her as someone who found joy in the simple pleasures of domestic life and who was looking forward to watching her daughters grow up and develop their own personalities and interests. 4-year-old Susan Jackson was a bright, energetic child who was just beginning to develop her own sense of independence and curiosity about the world around her. She was old enough to be aware of her surroundings and to understand that something was wrong when their routine trip home was interrupted, but too young to comprehend the full horror of what was about to happen to her and her family. 18-month-old Janet Jackson was still a baby who depended completely on her parents for care and protection. She had no way of understanding what was happening around her and no ability to protect herself from the violence that was about to destroy her family. As the Jackson family drove along the quiet country road near Bumpass, Virginia, they encountered Melvin David Rees, who had been prowling the rural areas of central Virginia looking for exactly the kind of opportunity that the family represented. Rees had chosen this area for several reasons. It was far enough from Washington, D.C. that he was unlikely to be recognized by anyone who knew him from his musical career. It provided numerous isolated locations where crimes could be committed without fear of interruption, and the rural roads were frequently traveled by families and couples who would make suitable victims for the kind of violent crimes he was planning. The encounter between Rees and the Jackson family began when he forced their car off the road, using the same aggressive driving tactics that he had employed in the attack on Margaret Harold and Sergeant Hudson nearly 2 years earlier. However, the circumstances of this attack were different in several important ways. Instead of targeting a young couple on a romantic outing, Rees was now confronting an entire family, including 2 very young children who would be completely helpless to resist whatever he had planned for them. When Carroll Jackson's car came to a stop, forced off the road by Rees's aggressive pursuit, the family must have been confused and frightened by what was happening to them. Carroll, as the head of the household and the person responsible for protecting his wife and children, probably tried to assess the situation and determine what kind of threat they were facing. He may have initially hoped that this was some kind of traffic incident or emergency that could be resolved through reasonable conversation. However, any hopes for a peaceful resolution were quickly shattered when Rees approached their car with his .38 caliber revolver drawn and made it clear that this was not an accident or a misunderstanding, but rather a deliberate criminal attack. The sight of the gun must have been terrifying for the entire family, but particularly for Carroll and Mildred, who immediately understood that their children were now in mortal danger. Rees's demands and behavior during the initial confrontation revealed that this was not a simple robbery or a crime motivated by financial gain. Instead of demanding money or valuables, he seemed primarily interested in gaining complete control over the family and forcing them to accompany him to a location where he could carry out whatever plans he had developed for them. This suggested that robbery was at most a secondary consideration, and that his real motivations were much more sinister and personal. The fact that Rees was willing to confront and attempt to control an entire family, including a grown man who might be expected to fight back in defense of his wife and children, demonstrated both his confidence in his ability to maintain control through the threat of violence and his determination to carry out whatever plans he had developed. This was not the impulsive act of someone who had stumbled upon an opportunity, but rather the calculated behavior of someone who had been planning this type of attack for some time. Carroll Jackson, faced with an armed man who was threatening his family, was in an impossible situation. Any attempt to fight back or resist could result in immediate violence against his wife and children, but compliance with the attacker's demands would put them at the mercy of someone who is clearly capable of extreme violence. As a father and husband, his primary concern would have been protecting Mildred, Susan, and Janet, even if it meant putting himself at greater risk. The decision that Carroll ultimately made was to comply with Rees's demands in hopes of keeping his family alive and creating opportunities to escape or get help. This decision was undoubtedly made under extreme duress, and in the hope that cooperation might lead to a situation where the family could survive the encounter. Unfortunately, what Carroll could not have known was that Rees had no intention of allowing any of them to survive, and that cooperation would only make it easier for him to carry out the murders he had already planned. Under threat of immediate violence, the Jackson family was forced to leave their car and accompany Rees to a location that he had apparently selected in advance as a place where he could carry out his crimes without fear of discovery or interruption. This location was in a remote, wooded area near Fredericksburg, Virginia, far from any houses or roads where someone might hear sounds of violence or screams for help. The transportation of the family to this remote location represented a significant escalation in Rees's criminal behavior. Unlike the Margaret Harold murder, which had been committed at the location where the initial encounter took place, the Jackson family murders involved kidnapping the victims and transporting them to a predetermined location. This suggested a much higher level of planning and preparation, as well as a desire to have extended time to carry out whatever acts of violence and torture he had fantasized about. Once he had the family isolated in the remote wooded location, Rees began to implement the plan that he had apparently been developing for months or possibly years. The evidence that would later be discovered by investigators suggested that what happened to the Jackson family during the hours that followed represented some of the most brutal and sadistic crimes ever committed in the region. Carroll Jackson, as the adult male and the most obvious threat to Rees's control over the situation, was apparently the first to be killed. The manner of his death suggested that Rees wanted to eliminate him quickly and efficiently so that he could focus his attention on the other members of the family without fear of interference. Carroll was shot in the back of the head execution style, a method that was both quick and brutal and that demonstrated Rees's cold-blooded approach to murder. However, rather than killing Carroll immediately upon arrival at the remote location, Rees apparently forced him to participate in or witness at least part of what was done to his wife and daughters before finally shooting him. This psychological torture was consistent with Rees's apparent desire to exercise complete dominance and control over his victims, extending their suffering for as long as possible while satisfying his own twisted psychological needs. The murder of 18-month-old Janet Jackson revealed the true depths of Rees's depravity and his complete lack of human compassion. Rather than killing the baby quickly, he apparently threw her alive into a ditch and then disposed of her father's body on top of her, causing her to suffocate slowly under the weight of Carroll's corpse. This act of incredible cruelty demonstrated that Rees was capable of inflicting suffering even on the most innocent and helpless of victims, and that no considerations of human decency or natural compassion could deter him from carrying out his twisted plans. The prolonged torture and murder of Mildred Jackson represented the culmination of the violent sexual fantasies that had driven Rees to commit these crimes in the first place. Evidence found at the scene and during the subsequent investigation suggested that she was subjected to hours of sexual assault and torture before finally being killed. The location where her body was eventually found, along with that of 4-year-old Susan, showed clear signs of the extended ordeal that both mother and daughter had endured. The fact that Rees kept Mildred and Susan alive for an extended period after killing Carroll and Janet demonstrated his desire to prolong the experience and to extract maximum gratification from the suffering of his victims. This was not the behavior of someone who was simply trying to eliminate witnesses to a robbery, but rather the calculated actions of a sexual sadist who had planned these crimes specifically for the purpose of exercising complete power and control over helpless victims. 4-year-old Susan Jackson, who was old enough to understand that something terrible was happening to her family, but too young to comprehend the full scope of the horror, was apparently forced to witness at least part of what was done to her mother before finally being killed herself. The evidence suggested that she was struck in the head with a blunt object, causing a skull fracture that resulted in her death. The fact that Rees was willing to kill a 4-year-old child in such a brutal manner demonstrated his complete lack of human feeling and his willingness to inflict suffering on anyone who crossed his path. Throughout this extended ordeal, Rees apparently took the time to document his crimes in written notes that would later be discovered by investigators. These notes, written in his own hand, described the murders in clinical, detached language that revealed his psychological state during the commission of the crimes. Rather than showing remorse or emotion, the notes revealed someone who viewed the murders as interesting experiences to be recorded and remembered, much like someone might document a vacation or a professional achievement. One of the most chilling aspects of these notes was the way they described his sense of ownership and control over his victims. He wrote about having complete power over the family members and about his ability to determine their fate according to his own desires. The notes revealed someone who saw other human beings not as individuals with their own rights and dignity, but rather as objects to be used for his own gratification and then discarded when they were no longer useful to him. The notes also revealed the philosophical framework that Rees had developed to justify his crimes to himself. He wrote about murder as simply another form of human experience, no different from any other activity, and about his right as a superior individual to explore all aspects of existence without being constrained by conventional moral rules. These writings provided a window into the mind of someone who had completely divorced himself from normal human emotions and moral considerations. The extended nature of the Jackson family murders, which apparently took place over several hours, also demonstrated Rees's confidence that he would not be discovered or interrupted during the commission of his crimes. This confidence was based on his careful selection of the remote location and his thorough planning of every aspect of the attack. It also reflected his growing belief in his own invincibility and his conviction that he was superior to ordinary people and their laws. When Rees had finally satisfied his violent and sexual impulses, he disposed of the bodies in a way that he apparently believed would prevent their discovery for as long as possible. Carol and baby Janet were dumped in a remote ditch, while Mildred and Susan were buried in a shallow grave in a wooded area. The careful disposal of the bodies suggested that Rees was thinking ahead to the investigation that would inevitably follow and was trying to buy himself time to cover his tracks and return to his normal life. After completing the murders and disposing of the bodies, Rees returned to Washington, D.C. and resumed his activities as a jazz musician, giving no outward indication that he had just committed one of the most horrific crimes in the region's history. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal activities and maintain his public persona allowed him to continue performing at local clubs and socializing with friends and colleagues as if nothing had happened. The Jackson family murders represented a significant escalation in Rees's criminal behavior, both in terms of the number of victims and the extended nature of the torture and violence involved. Unlike the Margaret Harold murder, which had been brutal but relatively quick, the Jackson family murders involved hours of prolonged suffering and demonstrated Rees's capacity for sustained cruelty and sadism. The fact that he had successfully committed such an extensive and complex crime without immediate detection probably reinforced his belief in his own superiority and invincibility. From his perspective, he had proven that his philosophical framework was correct and that he could indeed transcend ordinary moral constraints without facing consequences for his actions. However, what Rees did not realize was that the very complexity and extended nature of the Jackson family murders had created numerous opportunities for him to leave behind evidence that would eventually lead to his identification and capture. Unlike the Margaret Harold murder, which had involved a single victim and a relatively simple crime scene, the Jackson family murders had involved multiple victims, multiple crime scenes, and extended planning and preparation, all of which increased the likelihood that investigators would eventually find the evidence they needed to solve the case. The stage was set for one of the most intensive and complex criminal investigations in the region's history, as law enforcement agencies would eventually recognize the connections between the Harold and Jackson murders and begin to develop a profile of one of the most dangerous serial killers of his generation. The winter of 1959 passed slowly for law enforcement officials in Virginia and Maryland, who were struggling to make sense of what appeared to be an increasing number of violent crimes in their jurisdictions. The Margaret Harold murder remained unsolved nearly 2 years after it had been committed, and investigators were beginning to fear that they might never identify the person responsible for that brutal crime. What they did not yet realize was that the same predator who had killed Margaret Harold was about to reveal himself through an even more horrific series of crimes that would shock the region and launch one of the most intensive criminal investigations of the decade. The first indication that something terrible had happened to the Jackson family came when they failed to return home from their visit to relatives in the Apple Grove area. When Carol Jackson did not report for work on Monday morning, January 12, 1959, his employer initially assumed that he might be ill or dealing with some kind of family emergency. However, when he failed to call in or appear for work on Tuesday as well, his supervisor became concerned and contacted the Jackson family's neighbors and relatives to see if anyone knew what had happened to them. The initial inquiries revealed that the Jackson family had left their relative's home in Apple Grove on the evening of January 11th, intending to drive home along their usual route through the rural roads of central Virginia. They had seemed to be in good spirits and had given no indication that they were planning to stop anywhere or visit anyone else before returning home. The fact that they had simply vanished without a trace was both puzzling and deeply concerning to everyone who knew them. Local police were notified that the family was missing, and an initial search was organized to look for their car along the route they would have taken home. Officers drove along the rural roads between Apple Grove and the Jackson family's home, looking for any sign of their vehicle or any indication of what might have happened to them. However, the initial search produced no results, and investigators began to consider the possibility that the family had been the victims of foul play. As days turned into weeks with no sign of the missing family, the search was expanded to include larger areas and more law enforcement personnel. State police were brought in to coordinate the search efforts, and volunteers from the local community joined the effort to look for any trace of the Jackson family or their car. Despite these expanded efforts, no significant clues were discovered, and the fate of the family remained a complete mystery. The break in the case came nearly 2 months later, on March 4, 1959, when 2 men who were gathering brush near Fredericksburg, Virginia, made a gruesome discovery that would change the entire nature of the investigation. While working in a remote wooded area, they noticed what appeared to be human remains partially buried in a ditch. Upon closer examination, they realized they had discovered 2 bodies, and they immediately contacted local police. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found the decomposed remains of 2 individuals who were later identified as Carroll Vernon Jackson Jr. and his 18-month-old daughter Janet. The position of the bodies and the circumstances of their discovery immediately suggested that these were not natural deaths, but rather the result of foul play. Carroll had been shot in the back of the head execution style, while baby Janet had apparently suffocated under the weight of her father's body. The discovery of Carroll and Janet Jackson's bodies was shocking enough, but what made the crime scene even more horrifying was the realization that these were only 2 of the 4 missing family members. The absence of Mildred Jackson and 4-year-old Susan from the burial site meant that their bodies were somewhere else, and investigators immediately began searching the surrounding area for additional remains. The condition of the bodies and the manner in which they had been disposed of provided investigators with important clues about the nature of the crimes and the psychological makeup of the person responsible. The execution-style killing of Carol Jackson suggested that this was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong, but rather a calculated murder committed by someone who was comfortable with violence and who had probably planned the attack in advance. Even more disturbing was the evidence suggesting that baby Janet had been thrown into the ditch while still alive and had then suffocated when her father's body was disposed of on top of her. This act of incredible cruelty demonstrated that the perpetrator was capable of inflicting suffering even on the most innocent and helpless victims, and that no considerations of human decency or natural compassion could deter him from carrying out his plans. The fact that the bodies had been disposed of in a remote location, far from where the family had been traveling when they disappeared, indicated that the perpetrator had transported them to this location for the purpose of committing additional crimes before killing them. This suggested a much more complex and premeditated series of crimes than investigators had initially imagined, and it raised disturbing questions about what had happened to Mildred and Susan Jackson during the time between their abduction and the discovery of Carol and Janet's bodies. Forensic examination of the remains revealed additional details about the circumstances of the murders. Ballistics analysis of the bullet that had killed Carol Jackson showed that it had been fired from a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of weapon that had been used in the Margaret Harold murder nearly 2 years earlier. This connection was not immediately apparent to investigators, as the two crimes had occurred in different jurisdictions and had been handled by different law enforcement agencies, but it would later prove to be crucial in linking the cases together. The search for Mildred and Susan Jackson continued with renewed urgency following the discovery of Carol and Janet's bodies. If the perpetrator was capable of killing a grown man and an 18-month-old baby in such a brutal manner, investigators feared that the fate of the remaining family members might be even worse. The fact that their bodies had been disposed of separately suggested that they might have been kept alive for an extended period for purposes that investigators preferred not to contemplate. The expanded search for Mildred and Susan Jackson involved dozens of law enforcement officers and volunteers who combed through hundreds of acres of rural Virginia countryside, looking for any trace of the missing mother and daughter. The search was complicated by the harsh winter weather and the vast expanse of wooded and rural areas where the bodies might have been hidden. Despite these challenges, investigators were determined to find the remaining victims and to gather whatever evidence might help them identify and apprehend the person responsible for these horrific crimes. On March 21, 1959, nearly 3 weeks after the discovery of Carol and Janet's bodies, the search finally produced results when investigators found the shallow grave containing the remains of Mildred and 4-year-old Susan Jackson. The location where they were found was several miles away from where Carol and Janet had been discovered, in another remote wooded area that would have been virtually impossible to find without an intensive search effort. The condition of Mildred and Susan's bodies provided horrifying evidence of what they had endured before finally being killed. Both showed clear signs of having been tortured and sexually assaulted, and the evidence suggested that their ordeal had continued for hours before they were finally put to death. The brutality of what had been done to them was so shocking that even experienced investigators were deeply affected by what they observed at the crime scene. 4-year-old Susan had died from a skull fracture caused by a blow to the head with a blunt object, an act of violence against a child that demonstrated the perpetrator's complete lack of humanity and moral restraint. The fact that she had apparently been forced to witness at least part of what was done to her mother before being killed herself added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. Mildred Jackson had been subjected to extended torture and sexual assault before finally being strangled to death with her own stockings. The evidence suggested that her suffering had been deliberately prolonged, and that the perpetrator had taken sadistic pleasure in exercising complete control over her life and death. The manner of her killing demonstrated that this was not simply a crime motivated by sexual assault, but rather the work of someone who derived gratification from the infliction of suffering and the exercise of absolute power over helpless victims. The discovery of Mildred and Susan's bodies also revealed another disturbing aspect of the crimes. The location where they had been found was near the same abandoned building where investigators had discovered the collection of violent pornographic materials during their investigation of the Margaret Harold murder. This connection suggested that the same person might be responsible for both crimes, and that the abandoned building had been used as a base of operations for planning and carrying out multiple attacks. Inside the abandoned building, investigators found additional evidence that linked it to the Jackson family murders. There were signs that someone had been using the location recently, and forensic examination revealed traces of blood and other physical evidence that suggested violent crimes had been committed there. The building appeared to have been used not only for planning and fantasizing about violence, but also as an actual location where some of the torture and assault of the victims had taken place. The realization that the Margaret Harold murder and the Jackson family murders were connected marked a turning point in the investigation. Rather than dealing with two separate cases involving different perpetrators, investigators now understood that they were hunting a serial killer who had been operating in the region for nearly 2 years and who was likely to continue killing unless he was caught and stopped. The connection between the cases also provided investigators with additional evidence and clues that they could use to develop a profile of the perpetrator and to identify potential suspects. The fact that the same type of weapon had been used in both crimes, combined with the similar methods of operation and the connection to the abandoned building, suggested that they were dealing with someone who was methodical and organized in his approach to crime. The discovery of the Jackson family's bodies also revealed the escalation in the perpetrator's criminal behavior. While the Margaret Harold murder had been brutal, it had involved a single victim and had been completed relatively quickly. The Jackson family murders, by contrast, had involved multiple victims and had apparently continued for hours, demonstrating the perpetrator's increasing confidence and his willingness to take greater risks in pursuit of his twisted gratification. The evidence found at the various crime scenes also provided investigators with insights into the psychological makeup of the person they were hunting. The torture and sexual assault of the victims, the careful disposal of the bodies in separate locations, and the apparent documentation of the crimes all suggested someone who was not only capable of extreme violence, but who actually derived pleasure from the planning and execution of these acts. The impact of the Jackson family murders on the local community was profound and lasting. The idea that an entire family could be abducted and murdered in such a brutal manner shattered the sense of security that had previously existed in the rural communities of central Virginia. Parents became reluctant to allow their children to play outside unsupervised, and couples began to avoid the kinds of evening drives and outings that had been common in the past. Law enforcement agencies throughout the region were also deeply affected by the discovery of the Jackson family's bodies and the realization that they were dealing with a serial killer of unprecedented brutality. The crimes were unlike anything that had been encountered in the area before, and investigators recognized that they would need to use new techniques and approaches if they hoped to catch the person responsible. The discovery of the Jackson family's bodies marked the beginning of one of the most intensive criminal investigations in the region's history, as law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions worked together to identify and apprehend one of the most dangerous predators of his generation. The evidence that had been gathered from the various crime scenes provided a foundation for the investigation, but it would take nearly 2 more years of painstaking police work before the case would finally be solved and justice would be served for the innocent victims who had suffered and died at the hands of Melvin David Rees. The investigation into the Jackson family murders had been ongoing for more than a year when law enforcement officials received the break they had been desperately seeking. Despite the extensive physical evidence that had been gathered from the various crime scenes, and despite the clear connections that had been established between the Jackson family murders and the earlier Margaret Harold killing, investigators had been unable to identify a suspect who matched the profile they had developed of the perpetrator. The case seemed to have reached a frustrating dead end, with no new leads or evidence emerging despite the continued efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies. It was during this period of investigative stagnation that an anonymous letter arrived at the offices of law enforcement officials in Fredericksburg, Virginia. The letter, which was postmarked from the Washington, D.C. area, contained information that would ultimately prove to be the key to solving both the Jackson family murders and the Margaret Harold case. However, the initial response to this anonymous tip was skeptical, as investigators had received numerous false leads and crank letters during the course of their investigation. The anonymous letter was brief and to the point, containing just enough specific information to capture the attention of investigators while avoiding details that might have allowed the writer to be identified. The letter suggested that police should investigate a jazz musician named Melvin Rees who was known to perform at clubs in the Washington, D.C. area. According to the letter writer, Rees had made disturbing statements about the Jackson family murders and had exhibited behavior that suggested he might be involved in the crimes. What made this particular tip different from many others that had been received was the specific nature of some of the information it contained. The letter writer demonstrated knowledge of details about the crimes that had not been released to the public, suggesting that the information was coming from someone who had direct knowledge of either the crimes themselves or the person who had committed them. This level of specific knowledge immediately elevated the tip from the category of routine crank correspondence to something that demanded serious investigation. The letter also contained information about Rees's background and activities that could be independently verified by investigators. The writer described him as a talented musician who played multiple instruments and who had served in the military in Europe during the early 1950s. These details provided investigators with specific leads they could follow up on to determine whether the tip had any validity. However, despite the potentially significant nature of the information contained in the anonymous letter, investigators initially approached it with caution. They had been burned before by following up on tips that had seemed promising but had ultimately led nowhere, and they were reluctant to commit significant resources to investigating someone based solely on an anonymous accusation. The fact that the letter writer had chosen to remain anonymous also raised questions about their motivations and the reliability of their information. The initial investigation into Melvin Rees based on the anonymous tip involved routine background checks and inquiries into his activities and whereabouts during the times when the murders had been committed. Investigators discovered that he was indeed a jazz musician who performed regularly at clubs throughout the Washington, D.C. area, and that his background matched the details provided in the anonymous letter. They also learned that he had been married but was recently divorced, and that he was currently involved in a relationship with an actress and exotic dancer named Pat Barrington. However, when investigators attempted to locate Rees for questioning, they discovered that he had recently moved from his previous address and had left no forwarding information. This disappearance, coming at a time when the investigation into the Jackson family murders was intensifying, immediately raised suspicions about his possible involvement in the crimes. The fact that he had chosen to relocate without providing contact information suggested that he might be trying to avoid law enforcement attention. The search for Rees led investigators to the jazz clubs where he had previously performed, but club owners and fellow musicians reported that they had not seen him recently and did not know where he had gone. Some of the people who were interviewed during this phase of the investigation recalled that Rees had seemed increasingly erratic and unpredictable in his behavior during the weeks leading up to his disappearance, and that he had made disturbing comments about violence and morality that had made them uncomfortable. As investigators continued to follow up on the anonymous tip, they began to uncover additional information that suggested Rees might indeed be the person they were looking for. A routine check of motor vehicle records revealed that he owned a car that matched the description of the vehicle seen near the Margaret Harold crime scene, and that he had been living in the area at the time that crime was committed. This information provided the first concrete connection between Rees and the murders that investigators had been investigating. The investigation also revealed that Rees had attended the University of Maryland during the mid-1950s, a detail that proved to be significant when investigators discovered that one of the pieces of evidence from the Margaret Harold crime scene was a photograph of a University of Maryland student named Wanda Tipton. When investigators interviewed Tipton, she initially denied knowing Rees, but under persistent questioning, she eventually admitted that she had dated him during their time at the university. This connection between Rees and evidence from the Margaret Harold crime scene provided investigators with the first solid link between him and the murders they were investigating. The fact that a photograph of his former girlfriend had been found at the abandoned building near the Harold crime scene strongly suggested that he had been using that location for the planning and fantasizing about his crimes, just as investigators had suspected. However, despite the growing body of circumstantial evidence connecting Rees to the murders, investigators were still unable to locate him for questioning. The search for his whereabouts expanded to include law enforcement agencies in other states, as investigators suspected that he might have fled the area in order to avoid capture. This expanded search was complicated by the fact that Rees was a traveling musician who could easily blend into the music scenes of other cities without attracting attention. The frustration of investigators at being unable to locate their prime suspect was shared by the anonymous letter writer, who had apparently been following the progress of the investigation and had become increasingly concerned that Rees might escape justice. Several months after the original anonymous letter had been sent, the writer took the dramatic step of coming forward in person to provide additional information and to urge investigators to intensify their search for Rees. The decision of the anonymous letter writer to come forward in person marked a crucial turning point in the investigation. The writer, who identified himself as Glenn Moser, was a friend and acquaintance of Rees who had become increasingly concerned about his behavior and his possible involvement in the murders that had been committed in the region. Moser's decision to break his anonymity and provide direct assistance to investigators demonstrated both his courage and his commitment to seeing justice done for the victims of these horrible crimes. Glenn Moser's relationship with Melvin Rees dated back several years, and he was able to provide investigators with detailed information about Rees's personality, his philosophical views, and his behavior during the time period when the murders had been committed. According to Moser, Rees had become increasingly obsessed with questions about morality and violence, and had often engaged in disturbing philosophical discussions about whether murder could be considered morally acceptable under certain circumstances. Moser recalled one particularly disturbing conversation that had taken place shortly before the Jackson family murders were committed. According to Moser, Rees had argued that murder was simply another form of human experience, no different from any other activity, and that truly enlightened individuals should be willing to explore all aspects of existence without being constrained by conventional moral rules. Rees had seemed to believe that individuals who were intellectually or spiritually superior to ordinary people had the right to transcend normal moral limitations and to act according to their own desires rather than society's expectations. What made these philosophical discussions particularly troubling, according to Moser, was the personal intensity with which Rees approached these topics. Rather than treating them as abstract intellectual exercises, Rees seemed to be working through his own moral justifications for acts of violence that he was seriously considering committing. The timing of these conversations, coming just before the Jackson family murders were committed, suggested that Rees had been using these discussions to prepare himself psychologically for the crimes he was planning. Moser also provided investigators with information about Rees's current whereabouts. According to Moser, Rees had contacted him recently and had mentioned that he was currently working at a music store in West Memphis, Arkansas. This information provided investigators with a specific lead they needed to locate their suspect and to bring him in for questioning about his possible involvement in the murders. The decision to come forward and provide this information was not an easy one for Moser, who had to weigh his loyalty to a friend against his responsibility to help solve horrific crimes and prevent additional victims. The fact that he ultimately chose to assist law enforcement demonstrated his recognition that his suspicions about Rees were serious enough to override personal considerations of friendship and loyalty. Moser's information about Rees's philosophical views and his timing in coming forward also provided investigators with valuable insights into the psychological makeup of their suspect. The fact that Rees had been engaging in detailed philosophical discussions about the morality of murder suggested that he was someone who needed to justify his actions to himself intellectually before he could carry them out. This psychological profile was consistent with the methodical and planned nature of the crimes that had been committed. The timing of Moser's decision to come forward also suggested that he had been observing Rees's behavior carefully and had become increasingly concerned about his possible involvement in the murders as the investigation had progressed. The fact that he had initially chosen to provide information anonymously, but had later decided to come forward in person demonstrated the internal struggle he had faced in deciding how to handle his suspicions about his friend. With the specific information provided by Moser about Rees's location in West Memphis, Arkansas, investigators were finally able to move forward with plans to apprehend their suspect and to search for additional evidence that might connect him to the murders they had been investigating. The anonymous tip that had initially seemed like just another routine lead had ultimately provided the key to solving one of the most challenging and horrific criminal cases in the region's history. The courage shown by Glenn Moser in coming forward with information about his friend would prove to be instrumental in bringing Melvin David Rees to justice and in preventing him from committing additional crimes against innocent victims. His decision to place public safety and justice above personal loyalty demonstrated the kind of civic responsibility that is essential to the effective functioning of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. The information provided by Glenn Moser about Melvin Rees's location in West Memphis, Arkansas, galvanized law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions into coordinated action. After more than 2 years of frustrating investigation with few concrete leads, investigators finally had a specific suspect with a known location, and they moved quickly to capitalize on this breakthrough before their target could disappear again. The decision to pursue Rees in Arkansas required coordination between law enforcement agencies in Virginia, Maryland, and Arkansas, as well as the involvement of federal authorities who had jurisdiction over crimes that cross state lines. The kidnapping and transportation of the Jackson family members across state boundaries brought the case under federal jurisdiction, which meant that the FBI would play a leading role in the apprehension of the suspect and the coordination of the investigation. FBI agents working on the case recognized that they were dealing with someone who had already demonstrated considerable cunning and planning ability in committing his crimes, and avoiding detection. The fact that Rees had successfully disappeared from the Washington, D.C. area just as the investigation was intensifying suggested that he was aware of the law enforcement interest in him and was taking steps to avoid capture. This made it crucial that the arrest operation be planned and executed carefully to prevent him from escaping again. The involvement of federal authorities also brought additional resources and expertise to the investigation that had not been available to local law enforcement agencies. The FBI had experience in dealing with complex, multi-jurisdictional cases and had access to forensic laboratories and investigative techniques that could be crucial in building a case against Rees if he was indeed the perpetrator of the crimes they were investigating. Federal agents began by conducting surveillance of the music store in West Memphis, where Moser had indicated that Rees was working. This surveillance was designed to confirm his presence at the location and to gather intelligence about his daily routines and activities that could be used to plan the most effective approach for his apprehension. The agents were careful to maintain their surveillance from a distance to avoid alerting Rees to their presence and potentially causing him to flee again. The surveillance operation confirmed that Rees was indeed working at the music store and that he appeared to be living in the West Memphis area under his own name, suggesting that he may not have been aware of the extent of the law enforcement interest in him. This was encouraging news for investigators, as it suggested that they might be able to apprehend him without the kind of dramatic confrontation that might have been necessary if he had been actively trying to evade capture. However, the surveillance also revealed that Rees was maintaining the same kind of low profile that had served him well throughout his criminal career. He appeared to be living quietly and working regularly, giving no outward indication of the violent crimes he had committed or the ongoing law enforcement investigation that was focused on him. This ability to maintain a normal facade while harboring such dark secrets was consistent with the psychological profile that investigators had developed of their suspect. On June 24, 1960, nearly 3.5 years after the murder of Margaret Harold and more than a year after the Jackson family murders, federal agents moved to apprehend Melvin David Rees at the music store where he was working in West Memphis, Arkansas. The arrest was carried out without incident, as Rees offered no resistance when confronted by federal agents who identified themselves and informed him that he was under arrest for kidnapping and murder. The calm manner in which Rees submitted to arrest was consistent with his behavior throughout his criminal career, as he had always prided himself on maintaining control and composure even in the most extreme circumstances. However, his apparent lack of surprise at being arrested suggested that he may have been expecting this moment and had perhaps even been preparing for it psychologically. Following his arrest, Rees was taken into custody and informed of his rights, after which he was questioned extensively about his activities and whereabouts during the times when the murders had been committed. Initial questioning revealed that he was indeed familiar with the areas where the crimes had taken place and that he could not provide solid alibis for the relevant time periods. However, he maintained his innocence and denied any involvement in the murders. While Rees was being questioned by federal agents, other investigators were conducting a thorough search of his residence and workplace in West Memphis, looking for any evidence that might connect him to the crimes under investigation. This search was authorized by federal warrants that had been obtained based on the information provided by Glenn Moser and the circumstantial evidence that had been gathered during the previous phases of the investigation. The search of Rees's residence proved to be one of the most crucial aspects of the entire investigation, as investigators discovered evidence that definitively connected him to both the Margaret Harold murder and the Jackson family murders. Hidden in a saxophone case, investigators found a .38 caliber revolver that would later be determined by ballistics analysis to be the weapon used in both crimes. The discovery of this gun provided the physical evidence that investigators had been seeking for more than 3 years. Even more significant than the discovery of the murder weapon was the collection of handwritten notes and documents that investigators found among Rees's possessions. These notes, written in Rees's own handwriting, contained detailed descriptions of the Jackson family murders that could only have been written by someone who had been present during the commission of the crimes. The notes described the murders with a clinical detachment that was both chilling and incriminating. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a handwritten note that was paper-clipped to a newspaper photograph of Mildred Jackson. The note described killing Carol Jackson and baby Janet, and then stated, "Now the mother and daughter were all mine." The note went on to describe in disturbing detail what had been done to Mildred Jackson before she was finally killed, including the statement that "I was her master." These notes represented more than just evidence of Rees's guilt. They provided a window into the mind of a killer and revealed the psychological motivations behind his crimes. The detached, almost clinical tone of the writing suggested someone who viewed murder not as a moral failing, but as an interesting experience to be documented and remembered. The emphasis on power and control revealed the true nature of his crimes, which were not motivated by simple sexual desire, but by a need to exercise absolute dominance over helpless victims. The discovery of these incriminating notes and the murder weapon provided investigators with the evidence they needed to build a strong case against Rees for both the Harold and Jackson murders. However, the investigation was far from over, as there were still many questions about the full extent of his criminal activities and whether he might have been responsible for additional crimes that had not yet been connected to him. While Rees was in custody, investigators began the process of presenting their evidence to witnesses who had been involved in the original investigations. Sergeant Roy Hudson, who had survived the attack that killed Margaret Harold, was asked to view a lineup that included Rees and several other men of similar appearance. Hudson was able to positively identify Rees as the man who had forced him and Harold off the road, and who had shot Harold in the face during the summer of 1957. This identification by the sole surviving witness to one of the murders provided additional confirmation of Rees's guilt and strengthened the case that prosecutors would eventually present in court. The fact that Hudson was able to make a positive identification more than 3 years after the traumatic events he had witnessed demonstrated both the accuracy of his original description and the lasting impact that the experience had had on his memory. The investigation also expanded to include a more thorough examination of Rees's activities and associations during the period when the murders had been committed.